The moment. Eliza Marlowe walked through the door of the Red Hollow Ladies' Society. She already knew something was wrong. The room went quiet the way rooms only go quiet when the person who just entered is the subject of whatever was being said a half-second before. 14 women in their Sunday best turned to look at her, not with curiosity, not with welcome, but with the particular satisfaction of people who have decided something and are waiting to see if they were right. Margaret Holt, who ran the society the way a general runs a campaign, set down her teacup with a precise little click. "Miss Marlowe," she said, "we weren't expecting you." "The meeting is open to all women of Red Hollow," Eliza said. "It says so on the notice." "The notice is a formality," Margaret smiled. "Some of us assumed you'd have the good sense to understand that certain invitations aren't meant for everyone." The women laughed, not loudly, but enough. Enough that Eliza felt it in her chest, that specific vibration of a room full of people who have decided you are beneath them and enjoy knowing it. She should have left. Any sensible woman would have. Instead, she sat down in the nearest empty chair, folded her hands in her lap, and said nothing. If you've ever sat in a room where every pair of eyes told you that you didn't belong, if you've ever had to decide, in the space of a single breath, whether to stay or go, then you already know exactly what Eliza Marlowe felt in that moment. The question isn't whether it hurts. The question is what you do with the hurt. This is the story of what she did with it. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. And drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now let's begin. Eliza had not always been the kind of woman people laughed at. There had been a time, not so long ago, when she was simply a schoolteacher's daughter from a decent family in a decent town in Ohio, with decent prospects and a reasonable expectation that her life would unfold in a reasonable fashion. She had studied hard, read widely, and believed, the way young women of her generation were carefully taught to believe, that competence and good character would eventually be rewarded. Then her father died. He left behind a small house with a large mortgage, a collection of books that could not be sold for enough to matter, and a letter from the Hartwell Academy for Young Ladies of Cincinnati informing Eliza that her application for a teaching position had been declined. The letter was polite. It was also, in the spaces between its carefully chosen words, unmistakable. The Academy sought women of a certain presentation, a certain refinement of appearance. Eliza was intelligent, yes. Her references spoke well of her, but the students' families expected a particular standard, and the board had determined, with great regret of course, that she did not meet it. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it, put it in the stove, and started making other arrangements. She was not beautiful by the standards the Hartwell Academy meant when it used words like presentation and refinement. Her face was too angular, her hands too large from years of household work, her posture carrying the particular stiffness of a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She was tall when shorter would have been preferred. She had no softness to her that hadn't been earned the hard way. What she had was this: she was stubborn as a bad winter. She read everything she could get her hands on. She had a sharp memory, an even sharper instinct for when something wasn't adding up, and a complete inability to pretend she didn't notice things she'd clearly noticed. These qualities had never made her popular. Red Hollow, Kansas was not where she'd intended to land. It was where she'd landed when the money ran out, and the only offer on the table was a room above the dry goods store in exchange for keeping accounts. The town was young and rough, and full of people trying to become something, which meant it was also full of people who had decided the surest way to seem like something was to make sure everybody else seemed like less. Margaret Holt had been in Red Hollow for 4 years, which made her practically a founding member of its social order. Her husband owned the feed mill and half the commercial properties along the main street. She had organized the Ladies' Society in year 2, the school board committee in year 3, and by year 4 she had achieved the considerable civic accomplishment of becoming the person whose opinion determined what was acceptable and what was not. Eliza had known women like Margaret before. She understood them the way you understand weather, not fondly, but practically. You don't argue with a cold front, you just dress for it and go about your business. The trouble was, Margaret had decided that Eliza's business was her business. It started with small things. A comment at the mercantile about the quality of the fabric Eliza had chosen for her work dress. A remark, delivered to no one in particular while Eliza was standing 3 feet away, about how certain women mistake frugality for virtue. An inquiry, posed with perfect sweetness at the post office counter about whether Eliza had given any further thought to settling her situation, meaning finding a husband, since obviously her current arrangement was so very temporary. Eliza had endured these things without much outward response, which Margaret seemed to find unsatisfying, so the comments grew sharper and the audiences grew larger. The Ladies' Society meeting was not an accident. Eliza had understood that when she walked in. Margaret had made sure the notice was posted in a place where Eliza would see it, had made sure the timing was one Eliza could manage, and had made sure the room was full when Eliza arrived. The whole thing had been arranged as carefully as a stage production, and Eliza was meant to be the entertainment. She sat in her chair and she did not perform for them. Margaret tried a few more approaches, the raised eyebrow at Eliza's dress, the whispered exchange with the woman beside her, the pointed silence when Eliza tried to contribute to a discussion about the school children's harvest festival. And when none of them produced the desired reaction, she finally resorted to the direct approach. "Miss Marlowe," she said, during a pause in the proceedings, "I think we all appreciate your interest in community matters, but I do wonder whether someone in your position might find her time better spent in other ways. You must have so much to manage, with your work and your situation being what it is." Every woman in the room was watching. "My situation," Eliza said, "is that I live and work in this town the same as anyone else in this room." "Of course." Margaret's smile did not waver. "But some of us have families to consider, households, responsibilities that naturally give us a different perspective on community needs." The implication was clean as a knife edge. You are alone. You are unclaimed. You have no stake here that the rest of us are required to respect. Eliza felt the old familiar heat rise in her face. Not quite anger, not quite humiliation, but the particular combination of both that comes from being dismissed in front of witnesses by someone who has decided your life is worth less than theirs. She was trying to decide how to answer it when the door to the meeting hall opened. Caleb Whitaker came in, the way men who don't usually attend ladies' society meetings tend to come in. Hesitantly, hat in hand, clearly aware he was in the wrong place but too desperate to care. He was somewhere in his early 40s, rangy and weathered, with the look of a man who had been dealing with a problem for so long he'd stopped being embarrassed about it and arrived at something past exhaustion. "Beg your pardon," he said to the room. "I heard there might be someone here who could help me." Margaret turned to him with the particular graciousness she reserved for men of property. Caleb Whitaker owned the old Whitaker Ranch, 300 acres east of town, which meant he was tolerated even if his domestic situation made him a subject of regular commentary. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "whatever brings you to us today?" "I need someone to take on my boys," he said. "Governess? Teacher. Whatever the right word is. Third one quit on me this month." The room shifted, not with sympathy, with the pleasant quickening that comes before something interesting happens. Margaret folded her hands. "Mr. Whitaker, I think we've all tried to help with this. The simple fact is that your boys have a reputation in this town that makes it very difficult to—" "I know what their reputation is," he said. "I'm not asking you to change what you think about them. I'm asking if anybody here has an idea where I can find someone willing to try." Silence. Not the silence of people thinking. The silence of people who have already decided and are waiting for someone else to say the obvious thing out loud. Eliza looked at Caleb Whitaker. She looked at the way he held his hat, both hands, turning it slowly. The kind of thing a man does when he's been holding himself together so long that his hands need somewhere to put the tension. She looked at his face, which was not the face of a man who had given up, but of a man who was very close to it and knew the difference. She said, "Tell me about them." Every head in the room turned toward her. Caleb looked at her like he wasn't sure she was talking to him. "Your boys," she said. "Tell me about them." He hesitated, then, slowly, as though he hadn't been asked this question in a long time, and needed to remember how to answer it. "Ethan's 14. He's got his mother's temper, and he doesn't trust easy. Cole's 11. He's clever, maybe too clever, uses it the wrong way mostly. And Noah's 8. He's quiet. Hasn't been right since their mother died." "How long ago?" 3 years. "How many governesses before the 3 this month?" He looked at her. 7, over the 2 years before. And what does everyone say is wrong with them? That they're wild, uncontrollable, that they drove their mother to an early grave, though that's the cruelest and most ignorant thing I've ever heard said about children. His voice had gone flat and careful, the voice of a man who has learned to say certain things without letting feeling into them. They say Ethan started the fire in the schoolhouse, which he didn't, but nobody's interested in what actually happened. They say Cole hit the Henderson boy, which he did, though the Henderson boy had spent 3 days calling Noah names I won't repeat. And Noah they just call slow, which he isn't. He's grieving. And the two things look the same from a distance if you're not paying attention. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Margaret made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, the sound of someone preparing to be gracious about something they find tedious. Miss Marlowe, I'm sure Mr. Whitaker appreciates the interest, but perhaps this isn't quite— What do you pay? Eliza asked. Caleb blinked. $30 a month, room and board. I'll want Sundays off. Miss Marlowe, Margaret said, I'll want the boys' schedule explained to me directly, not through you, Eliza continued, still looking at Caleb. I'll want to know what they've been told about why the others left, and I'll want it understood between us before I step foot on that ranch, that I make my own decisions about how I handle them, and I don't need to consult anyone else in this town about it. Caleb stared at her. Something moved in his face. Not quite relief, because he was too far past easy relief for that, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who had been expecting to hear no and had just heard something he didn't know what to do with. You understand what you're walking into, he said. It wasn't a question. I understand what everyone in this room has said about what I'm walking into, Eliza said. That's not the same thing. Margaret made her sound again. Mr. Whitaker, I would strongly advise— Miss Marlowe, Caleb said. Can you start Monday? Yeah. She walked back to the room above the dry goods store in the thin October light and sat down on the edge of her bed and spent about 15 minutes being completely honest with herself about what she had just done. She had committed to going out to a ranch 3 miles east of town to manage 3 children who had driven off 10 people before her, on the basis of one conversation in a room full of women who were going to spend the next several days talking about her poor judgment. She had done this in front of Margaret Holt, which meant the story would be embellished and distributed before Sunday. She had done this without asking for references, without seeing the house, without knowing a single thing about the boys beyond what their father had told her, which was, by definition, a partial account. She also had $32 in savings, no other income prospect that paid a living wage, and a very clear memory of the sound of 14 women not quite laughing at her. The practical case and the emotional case arrived at the same conclusion, which she'd found was usually a sign that she was about to do something that couldn't be undone. She started making a list of what she'd need to bring. Monday morning was overcast. The sky, the particular flat gray that Kansas does in late October. The kind of sky that doesn't promise rain but doesn't rule it out either. Eliza had her trunk packed and sitting beside the door when Caleb Whitaker's wagon came down the main street at 7 o'clock. She carried the trunk down herself. Caleb climbed down to help with it, and she let him because there's practical stubbornness, and then there's the kind that wastes everyone's time. They rode east in silence for the first mile. The town thinned out behind them, and the land opened up, brown and wide under the flat sky. The kind of landscape that either makes you feel very small or very free, depending on the day. They know you're coming, Caleb said, eventually. What did you tell them? I told them I'd found someone willing to try. He paused. Ethan asked how long you'd last. Cole said to bet against the week. What did Noah say? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Nothing. He doesn't say much about anything anymore. Eliza looked out at the land. What was she like? She asked. Their mother. The question surprised him. She could feel it in the slight tension that went through the reins. What makes you ask that? Because she's the thing that's missing, Eliza said. And you can't understand what's wrong with a house until you understand what it's missing. He thought about it for a while. Her name was Clara. She was patient. More patient than I ever managed to be. The boys adored her, all 3 of them, each one differently. Ethan's anger started when she got sick and he didn't know what to do with it. Cole started with the jokes. Noah just shut. He paused again. She'd have hated what they've become, but she'd have understood it, She was better at understanding things than being angry about them. "You're angry about it," Eliza said. "Every day." "At them?" "At the situation, at myself." He glanced at her sidelong. "Not at them. I know it's not their fault. I don't always know how to reach them through it." Eliza nodded and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. A father who knew he was failing his children and couldn't figure out how to stop was not a problem that could be solved with words on a wagon bench. The ranch came into view around a long curve in the trail. A main house that had once been well built and was now simply weathered, a barn in better shape than the house, a few outbuildings that had seen better decades, a garden that had given up somewhere midsummer and hadn't been cleared, a water pump with a rusted handle, 3 wooden steps up to a front porch, the middle one cracked clean across. Standing on the porch, arranged in what Eliza recognized immediately as a defensive formation, oldest in front, youngest partially behind, were the 3 Whitaker boys. Ethan was taller than she'd expected, and thinner, with the angular awkwardness of a boy who had grown fast and hadn't settled into himself yet. His arms were crossed. His face was arranged in an expression of flat disdain that he had clearly practiced. Cole stood slightly to the right, and even from this distance she could see the performance in his posture. One hip cocked, a faint smirk already prepared. A boy who had decided that if the world was going to be a joke on him, he was going to be in on it before anyone else. And behind Cole's shoulder, just his face visible, Noah, small for 8, with his father's dark coloring and large, still eyes that tracked her with an attention that none of the others were bothering to disguise. Caleb stopped the wagon. Eliza climbed down without waiting for help and stood in the dirt yard looking up at the 3 of them. "Well," Ethan said before she could speak, "here's number 11. 10, Cole corrected. "You forgot to count Miss Healy, who technically quit before she unpacked." "Good morning," Eliza said. Silence. "My name is Eliza Marlowe. I expect your father's told you why I'm here." She looked at each of them in turn. Ethan's deliberate contempt, Cole's prepared amusement, Noah's careful watchfulness. "I have a few things I'd like you to know before we begin." "Does it matter what we want to know?" Ethan said. "Not especially," Eliza said. "I didn't ask." That landed differently than he'd expected. She could see it in the small shift around his eyes. He'd been ready for patience, or firmness, or the various approaches that worked for about a week before they stopped working. He hadn't been ready for someone to simply say no to the question while keeping her voice entirely level. "First thing," Eliza said, "I'm not here to be liked. I'm not here to be your friend, and I'm not trying to replace your mother. I'm here because your father asked for help, and I agreed to provide it, and I intend to keep my agreement." "Generous of you," Cole said, with bright practiced sarcasm. "Second thing," she looked at Cole directly. "The jokes. I don't mind them. But I'll know the difference between funny and cruel, and so will you, and when you go for cruel, I'll tell you so." Cole's smirk held, but it shifted slightly, became less certain of itself. "Third thing," she looked at Noah. "You don't have to talk to me. You don't have to like me. But I'm going to be here, and I'm going to pay attention to what's happening, whether you say anything about it or not." She held his gaze for a moment. He didn't look away. "That's all." She picked up the near end of her trunk and looked at Caleb, who was watching the whole thing with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Can someone show me where I'm sleeping?" she said. "Or should I guess?" The room they gave her was off the kitchen, small, with a window that faced north, a rope bed with a thin mattress, and a hook on the wall for her clothes. The wallpaper had been chosen by someone with more hope than taste, and had been peeling for long enough that the peeling had become the pattern. She put her things away with the efficiency of a woman who had moved before and expected to move again, though she gave herself no more than 30 seconds to acknowledge that before she put the thought away and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was a disaster of benign neglect. Not dirty, exactly, but overwhelmed. Dishes done badly and stacked anyhow. A larder that had things in it but required creative interpretation. A stove that worked but had not been properly cleaned since some time previous. The kind of kitchen that had been maintained by a series of people who each assumed someone else would deal with the underlying problems. She was taking an inventory of what she had to work with when she heard, behind her, the sound of someone trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. She didn't turn around. "The flour bin is almost empty," she said. "We'll need to deal with that. And whoever last cleaned the stovepipe didn't finish the job." A pause. Then, in the small voice of someone who has been caught out, Papa usually does the flour. Noah, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her with those large, careful eyes. Does he go to town for it? She said, still not turning around, keeping her voice conversational. Or does someone deliver? Another pause. She counted 3 full seconds. Town, Noah said. Saturdays. We can make that work, she said. She finally turned around and looked at him, making sure her face was doing nothing particular. Not warm, not sharp, just attentive. Do you know if there are eggs? He blinked. Then he said, still small but more certain, chickens are in the back. Cole usually forgets to collect. Would you show me where? He looked at her for a long moment, with the particular measuring gaze of a child who has learned that adult kindness usually comes with conditions attached and is trying to figure out what this one costs. Then he turned and walked toward the back door. She followed. She lasted the week. She was not naive enough to think that meant she'd won anything, because she hadn't. What she had done was survive 7 days without being run off, which the boys apparently viewed as simultaneously an offense and a curiosity. Ethan she saw least of. He had chores that took him far from the house, and he performed them with the grim efficiency of someone who would rather deal with animals than people. He came inside for meals, ate without speaking or incident, and went back out. He did not warm. He did not test her in any obvious way. He simply refused to engage, which was its own kind of test, and she recognized it for what it was, the waiting strategy of a boy who had learned that people eventually did something he could point to as a reason to stop trusting them. Cole tested her differently and more directly. He accidentally knocked her lesson materials into the mud on Tuesday. He told Noah that the new governess had cried the night before, she hadn't, and watched to see if Eliza would correct the story when she overheard. He asked her a series of increasingly elaborate questions about arithmetic that she suspected were designed to find a gap in her knowledge he could use against her. She answered all the arithmetic correctly. About the mud, she said nothing and replanned the lesson. About the story he'd told Noah, she waited until she and Cole were alone at the kitchen table that evening and said, conversationally, I don't cry when I'm upset. I get quiet, and then I decide what to do about the thing that upset me. If you're planning to predict my behavior, that's more useful than what you told your brother. Cole stared at her. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to his letter-writing practice and did not look at her again for the rest of the evening, which she took as a sign that she'd reached him somewhere below the performance. Noah collected eggs with her every morning. He hadn't offered this. She had simply gone to the chicken coop on Tuesday, and he had appeared at her side with a basket, and it had become, without either of them arranging it, a fixed point in the morning. He talked a little. Not much, and not about anything heavy. Where the chickens liked to hide eggs, what their names were. He had named them all. Cole claimed he hadn't, but Eliza noticed that Cole used the names when he thought no one was listening. Whether it would rain. The small, safe vocabulary of a child who has learned that bigger subjects carry consequences. She was careful with it. She matched his register, kept things light, asked only what she was ready to let drop if he didn't want to answer. She had dealt with children before, in the schoolrooms of Ohio, and she knew that the worst thing you could do with a quiet child was push too soon toward the silence underneath the silence. On Friday evening, after the boys were in bed, Caleb sat across from her at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and said, without preamble, Cole asked me today if you were still here because you felt sorry for them. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know. Are you? Eliza considered this honestly. I felt sorry when I heard about them, she said. I don't now. Pity isn't a useful thing to feel about people you're spending time with. Then why are you here? She thought about it. Outside, the October wind moved across the land, and the house settled around them, and somewhere in the dark above the ceiling, one of the boys turned over in his sleep. I said I would be, she said finally, and I don't make commitments I don't intend to keep. Caleb looked at her for a moment over his coffee cup. That's a thin reason. It's a solid one, she said. The thin reasons are the ones that sound better. He didn't answer that, but she thought, looking at his face, that it had landed somewhere it would sit for a while. The week was not a victory. The week was a beginning, uncertain, uneven, full of the specific exhaustion of being in a house where every person in it was waiting for you to become the thing they already expected. But it was a beginning. And Eliza Marlowe, who had spent 34 years being told she would fail at one thing or another, had learned that beginnings were the part where you just kept showing up. She washed the coffee cups, put out the lamp, and went to bed. The second week began with a theft, not a dramatic one. No confrontation, no broken glass, no one caught in the act. Eliza simply went to her room after breakfast on Monday morning to retrieve her lesson ledger, where she kept her notes on each boy's progress and the materials she'd planned for the week, and it was not on the desk where she had left it. She checked under the bed, behind the small trunk, along the windowsill. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the space where the ledger should have been, and then she went back to the kitchen and started washing the breakfast dishes. Cole watched her from the doorway. He'd positioned himself with the practiced casualness of a boy who wants you to know he's watching, but doesn't want you to make anything of it. She washed and dried 4 plates before she said anything. "The ledger will need to come back by this afternoon," she said, not looking at him. "I don't particularly care how it gets there." "I don't know what you're talking about," Cole said. "All right." She stacked the plates. That's it, he said. "You're not going to—" "I'm going to finish the dishes," she said. "Then I'm going to go over the arithmetic I had planned from memory, which is less convenient but not impossible. Then around 3 o'clock I'll check my room again, and if the ledger is back, we'll carry on. If it isn't, I'll sit down with your father tonight, and we'll discuss what kinds of responsibilities a boy who has extra time on his hands could reasonably take on." She heard him shift in the doorway. "You can't just— You're supposed to punish me." Eliza turned around and looked at him. "Why?" He opened his mouth and closed it again. He was 11 years old and clever in the specific way of children who have been underestimated for long enough that they've turned the underestimation into a weapon. And the look on his face right now was the look of someone who has aimed that weapon and had it fail to fire. "Because that's what they do," he said finally, "when you take something." "Is that what you want? To be punished?" He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Nobody wants to be punished." "Some people do," Eliza said. "It's easier than being understood." She turned back to the dishes. Behind her, she heard Cole stand very still in the doorway for another moment, and then the sound of his boots on the floorboards retreating down the hall. The ledger was back on her desk by noon, exactly where she'd left it, spine aligned with the edge, as though it had never moved. She did not mention it to anyone. What she was learning in those second and third weeks was that the Whitaker house was a place that had organized itself around absence. Not disorder exactly. The boys had their responsibilities and mostly performed them. The animals were fed, the firewood was split, the kitchen functioned after a fashion. But the systems in the house were all reactive. Everything was arranged around preventing the worst rather than building toward anything better. Caleb managed it the way a man manages a slow leak. Enough attention to keep it from flooding the floor, not enough to actually fix the pipe. She understood why. He was one person with 3 children and 300 acres, and he'd spent 2 years watching the attempts at help fail in succession. A man in that position doesn't plan toward better. He plans toward getting through to Thursday. The first real crack appeared in the 3rd week, on a Tuesday, when Eliza found out about the peaches. She had been walking the fence line on the north edge of the property. She made a habit of walking the property boundaries because she'd found it was the only way to know what was actually out there, rather than what she'd been told was out there, when she nearly stepped into a hole that had not been there the previous week. It was about the size of a bucket. The dirt around it was loose and recently turned, and running along the fence line in both directions from the hole were scattered peach pits, dried and brown, like a trail left by someone who hadn't noticed they were leaving it. She looked at the hole. She looked at the fence. On the other side of the fence was the corner of the Henderson orchard, the Hendersons who owned the property directly adjacent to the Whitaker ranch, who had been the source of the remark about Cole hitting their son, who maintained a complicated and chilly non-relationship with Caleb that Eliza had been told about in careful pieces by each member of the household, each version slightly different. She followed the fence line back to the house and found Noah in the garden, half-heartedly turning a patch of earth that had been meaning to be a winter garden for several weeks without becoming one. "How long ago," she said, sitting down on the low stone wall at the garden's edge, "did Cole and Ethan take the peaches?" Noah did not look up from his digging. He turned over another shovelful of dirt. "Noah." "I didn't do it," he said quietly. "I know you didn't. How long?" He was quiet for a moment. The shovel went in and came back out. "Last week," he said. Thursday. Do you know how many? Cole said about 2 bushels. Eliza sat with that for a moment. 2 bushels of peaches from the Henderson orchard through a fence hole by boys who already had a complicated history with that family specifically. She thought about what Margaret Holt would do with that information if it reached her. She thought about what it would give people who were already looking for reasons to make noise about the Whitaker children. Did they eat them? She asked. Noah's mouth moved in something that might, in a different child, in a different moment, have been the start of a smile. Cole sold some to Danny Pruitt for 5 cents. Eliza put her face briefly in her hands. Okay, she said. Thank you. She went to find Ethan. I was in the barn, which was his preferred location for everything that didn't require him to be elsewhere. He was repairing a piece of tack with the focused, economical movements of someone who had learned the work well and found it preferable to most human contact. He didn't look up when she came in. I know about the peaches, she said. The movement of his hand slowed but didn't stop. Henderson won't say anything, Ethan said. He doesn't want the trouble. That's not the point. Then what's the point? She looked at him, the long, angular face bent over the leather, the careful deliberateness of his hands, the tension across his shoulders that was always there, that she'd come to understand was his resting state, the way a body holds itself when it has learned to expect attack. You took something that wasn't yours, she said, from neighbors, with your brother, who already has a mark against him with that family. Cole's idea. You went with him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he shouldn't have gone alone. It was such an honest thing to say, and so clearly said without meaning to be honest, that Eliza had to give herself a second before she answered. No, she said. He probably shouldn't have. Ethan finally looked up. His face did its usual thing, the surface expression of controlled distance that covered the more complicated things underneath. So what happens now? You're going to come to town with me on Saturday, she said, both you and Cole, and you're going to go to the Henderson house and tell them what you took and ask what a fair repayment would be. He stared at her. They'll tell the whole town. They might. Cole will... He stopped. He won't do it. He will if you go with him. She watched that land. She'd said it deliberately, not as flattery, but as a statement of what she'd observed to be true. Cole's bravado operated on an audience, and the audience he cared most about impressing was Ethan, and the things Ethan agreed to do, Cole found ways to do also. Ethan looked back down at the tack. The needle went through the leather. I'll pay for it, Eliza said. Whatever they say is fair. Out of my own wages. His head came up fast. Why would you do that? Because we're dealing with it quickly before it becomes something bigger, and because you don't have the money. I do. She paused. But you and Cole will plant replacement trees. I'll find out from Henderson what kind, and you'll do the work. That's the arrangement. Ethan's face went through several things in quick succession. She'd noticed this about him. The processing was visible, even when he tried to keep it off his face. The anger first, because that was the first response to most things. Then something harder to name, something that was close to the particular discomfort of being treated as a person capable of doing better, rather than as a problem capable of getting worse. Why do you care if it gets bigger? He said. Because things that get bigger tend to get harder to manage, and I'd rather deal with it now. That's not why, he said. He was looking at her directly, and there was something in his eyes that was older than 14. People who are just managing things don't pay out of their own wages for something somebody else's kid did. The barn was quiet around them, dust moving in the slant of afternoon light through the high window, the horses shifting their weight in their stalls. No, Eliza said. I suppose they don't. He waited. I don't like watching things that could be fine become disasters because nobody dealt with them at the right moment, she said. I've seen it happen enough times to find it irritating. It wasn't the whole answer, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. But it was a true piece of the answer, and she'd learned with Ethan that true pieces were more useful than complete explanations. He looked back down at the tack. I'll talk to Cole. She left him to it. Saturday came with the reluctant gray light of early November, the kind of morning that suggests winter is no longer a future problem. Eliza stood on the porch with both boys, Cole maintaining his usual performance of not caring about anything, while clearly vibrating with the specific anxiety of a boy who does not want to knock on the Henderson door, and Ethan standing beside him with the fixed expression of someone who has decided to do a thing and has shut the door on all further discussion of it. Caleb had offered to come. Eliza had said no. He'd looked at her for a long moment, reading something in her answer that she hadn't meant to put there, and then said only, "All right," and gone back inside. The Henderson house was on the north side of the main road into town, behind the orchard. Mrs. Henderson answered the door. A tall, thin woman in her 50s with a face that had settled into a permanent expression of mild imposition, like someone who has been waiting a long time for people to do what she already told them they should do. She looked at the two boys. She looked at Eliza. "Miss Marlowe," she said. Not warm, but not hostile either. "Mrs. Henderson, these boys have something they'd like to say." Cole opened his mouth. Eliza could feel him reaching for something deflecting, something clever. And then Ethan spoke first. "We took peaches from your orchard," Ethan said, "last Thursday, about 2 bushels. We went through the fence on the north corner." He said it cleanly, without decoration, the way he did most things he'd decided to do. "We shouldn't have. We're here to ask what you think is fair." Mrs. Henderson looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Cole. "That one sold some of mine to the Pruitt boy," she said to Eliza. "I'm aware," Eliza said. "Whatever the fair value is, I'll settle it today." "I don't want your money," Mrs. Henderson said. She was still looking at Cole. "I want to hear it from him." Cole's face went through about 4 things in 2 seconds. The performance dropped briefly, not completely, but enough that underneath it you could see the 11-year-old who had done something wrong and knew it and didn't know how to be in that knowledge without armor. "We took them," Cole said. His voice came out smaller than he intended, and he didn't try to adjust it. "I thought we wouldn't get caught, and I wanted—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what I wanted. It was yours." Something shifted in Mrs. Henderson's face. Not softening, exactly. She was not a woman who softened easily or quickly, but an adjustment, a small recalibration. "You'll plant me 2 trees in the spring," she said. "The kind I tell you to plant, where I tell you to plant them." "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said. "And if I see you near that fence line between now and then, I'll tell your father and the school board both." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Eliza one more time. "You're the new one." "I am." "They said you wouldn't last." "I've heard that," Eliza said. Mrs. Henderson looked at her for a long moment with the appraising patience of a woman who has lived long enough to take good measure of people quickly. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in and have coffee," she said. "It's cold." It was such an unexpected pivot that Cole actually looked at Eliza to see if it was a trap. She gave him nothing to read and walked through the door. The coffee was strong and the kitchen was warm, and Mrs. Henderson turned out to have opinions about land management, the inadequacy of the current postal service, and the proper way to store root vegetables over winter that she delivered with the same tone of mild imposition she'd greeted them with, as though the world's persistent failure to follow her recommendations was something she'd long since made her peace with. Cole, to Eliza's careful non-reaction, asked a question about the orchard. A real question. Not deflection, not performance. He wanted to know how you knew when a tree was done, when it would stop bearing and wasn't worth keeping. Mrs. Henderson told him, in more detail than the question probably required, and Cole listened with the particular quality of attention he only gave to things he actually cared about. On the walk back to where Caleb had left the wagon, Ethan walked close to Eliza but didn't say anything for about a 1/4 mile. Then, "She's not what I expected." "People usually aren't," Eliza said. Another 1/4 mile. "Cole's thinking about the trees," Ethan said. "I can tell." "I know." "He won't say so." "He doesn't have to." Ethan glanced at her sidelong. "You do that a lot. Let people not say things." "Is that a complaint?" He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to most things. "No," he said. "It's just different." She didn't push it further. She'd learned that with Ethan, the thing you didn't push was often the thing that kept moving on its own. November settled in hard the week after the Henderson visit. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days, and the Whitaker ranch had the particular cold of a place that sits exposed on flat land with nothing to break the wind coming from the north. Eliza added an extra blanket to her bed, found that the window in her room let in more air than it should, and spent a Saturday afternoon with strips of cloth and a determination to fix it that outlasted the cold's attempts to discourage her. The boys had school in town 3 days a week, and the 2 remaining weekdays she spent with them at the ranch. The school days were their own specific source of information. She could track what was happening there by what came home with them, in their moods and their silences, and the things they said without saying them. Ethan came home from school on a Wednesday in a silence that was different from his usual silence. His usual silence was contained, directed, the silence of someone who has decided to be in a room without engaging with it. This silence was rigid, with something hot running underneath it. She waited until after supper to ask. They were doing the washing up. She washed, Ethan dried, the job they'd settled into without arrangement, and she said, not looking at him, "What happened at school?" Not a question. He'd learned the difference. "Nothing that matters." She washed a pan and handed it to him. "Harlan Birch," Ethan said, after a moment. She knew the name. Harlan Birch was the eldest son of Gerald Birch, who owned the second largest spread of land east of Red Hollow, and who was, from everything Eliza had been able to piece together, a man whose primary relationship with his neighbors was determined by how useful they were to his business interests. The Birch family's alliance with the Holts was well understood in town. So was the fact that Harlan, at 17, had inherited his father's views on most things, along with his father's height and square jaw. "What did he say?" she asked. "Not just to me." Ethan dried the pan with more force than the pan required. "He was talking about the whole thing, about how the school board should do something about problem families. He was loud about it, in front of everyone." "And?" "I didn't touch him," Ethan said. His jaw was set. "I wanted to, but I didn't." "Good." "That's all you're going to say? Good?" She handed him a bowl. "What would you like me to say?" "I don't know. Something more than—" He stopped. He was saying things about my father, about whether a man who can't manage his own house should be managing land, about whether children like us should be around the other kids at school. Eliza kept her hands in the wash water and did not let anything into her voice that would give him something to react to instead of continue talking. "I know what they're doing," Ethan said. "Birch and Holt, the whole group of them. They want the North Acres. Papa won't sell. They've been trying to make it harder for him since last spring." His voice had dropped, not from softness, but from the particular flatness of someone stating facts they've had to think about a lot to get that calm about. "So now they're going after us. The boys. Making it about whether we're fit to be in town." Eliza looked at him. "You figured all that out," she said. "Cole figured out the parts about the land," Ethan said. "He listens at things he's not supposed to listen at." Cole, who eavesdropped on adult conversations and filed information away with the instincts of a small, sharp-eyed person who understood that information was the only currency available to people without money or size. "Does your father know?" she asked. "He knows about the land. He doesn't know—" Ethan paused. "He tries not to know about the things that are about us. I think it hurts him more than the land stuff." Eliza finished the washing and drained the basin. "You should tell him," she said. "He'll want to go to Birch." "Maybe he should." Ethan shook his head. "Birch has the whole board behind him. Going at them straight doesn't work. Papa tried that before with the water rights, and it cost him 2 seasons of grief for nothing. He was 14. He'd been watching his father fight this for long enough to have worked out strategy, and his strategy was not wrong. Eliza felt the particular frustration of recognizing that a child should not have to be this competent at this particular kind of problem. "You let me worry about that part," she said. He looked at her. "Why? What can you do?" She didn't answer immediately. She hung the washcloth over the stove rail and looked at the kitchen wall for a moment. The faded wallpaper, the small framed thing that had been Clara Whitaker's, a pressed flower of some kind in a cracked frame. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I tend to find things out." He looked at her with that older-than-14 gaze, measuring what she'd said, weighing it against the 6 weeks he'd had to observe her. "Miss Healy said things like that," he said, before she left. "I know." She picked up the lamp from the table. "The difference is, I'm still here." She went to bed and she lay in the dark with the wind pressing at the cloth-stopped window, thinking about Birch and Holt, and water rights and North Acres and 3 boys who had learned to survive things they should not have had to survive. And she thought, this is the thing. This is what they're actually up against. Not just the boys being difficult. Someone is making it worse on purpose. She went through it carefully, the way she went through problems that needed to be understood before they could be addressed. She did not solve it that night, but she made a start at knowing its shape. December came in with 2 days of hard snow, and then a freeze that turned the yard to iron. The boys were home from school for a week, while the road into town was impassable, and Eliza ran lessons at the kitchen table and discovered, in the contained space of a snowbound house, things she wouldn't have learned any other way. Cole read everything. This was not something he advertised. His performance was built on the persona of someone who found effort distasteful. But in the restricted hours of a snow week, when there was nothing to do and nowhere to go, she found him working through books from the shelf in the front room with the focused absorption of someone who had forgotten to keep the performance up. He read a surveying manual cover to cover, then a volume of American legal history that had been Caleb's father's, then asked if there were any more maps in the house. She found him a territorial survey map in the chest in the hallway, and he spread it on the floor and spent most of an afternoon with it, tracing routes and property lines with one finger, while Noah sat nearby constructing something out of sticks and cord that Eliza eventually identified as a model of the chicken coop, built to rough scale. Noah was building things. She'd noticed this over the previous weeks. The way his hands were always doing something, the stick structures and the rope knots and the small repairs he'd make to things around the house without being asked, without announcing them. He'd fixed the crack in the middle porch step sometime in mid-November. Eliza had noticed when she stopped nearly catching her foot in it. She hadn't said anything, and neither had he, and the step had simply been fixed. She sat down on the floor beside him on the third snow day and watched him work. "What's the cord for?" she asked. "It's how the roof sits," he said. "If you tie it right, it holds better." "Who taught you that?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mama knew how things worked. She used to say if you understood the why of a thing, you'd know how to fix it." He said it simply, the way children sometimes say the things that would break an adult's heart, straightforwardly, without apparent knowledge of how much weight the words carry. "She sounds like she was smart," Eliza said. "She was." He tied a small knot, tightened it. "Cole says it doesn't help to talk about her, that it just makes things worse." "What do you think?" Noah looked at his model for a while. "I think sometimes it helps, and sometimes it doesn't," he said. "And you can't always tell which it's going to be until you're already talking." Eliza didn't say anything to that. She stayed on the floor beside him while the snow pressed against the windows and the house held its warmth around them. It was Ethan who broke it. Not dramatically, not with a confrontation or a scene, but with a thing so small she nearly missed it. He came in from the barn at noon on the fourth snow day, stamping ice off his boots, and stopped in the kitchen doorway to look at the room. Cole on the floor with the map, Noah building, Eliza at the table working on correspondence she'd been meaning to catch up on. He stood there for a second, no more than that, and the expression on his face was something she'd not seen on him before. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, from the outside, like a person recognizing something they'd forgotten and then wondering how long it had been gone. Then he crossed the kitchen, got himself a cup of water, and said to Cole, "You've got the Birch property line wrong. It runs east another quarter mile." Cole looked up. "How do you know?" "Because I've walked it," Ethan said. "Papa was marking fence posts 2 summers ago. I went with him." Cole moved over on the map without being asked. Ethan crouched down beside him. Noah set down his model and leaned over to look. Eliza watched the three of them bent over the map together, shoulders nearly touching, arguing in the low, focused voices of people working on a real problem. And she thought about what Caleb had said that first evening, about Clara being patient, about Clara being better at understanding things than being angry about them. She'd have hated what they've become, but she'd have understood it. He'd said it like a failure. He hadn't seen what Eliza was seeing now, which was that underneath what they'd become, the thing they had been was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere. It had just been waiting. She looked back down at her correspondence. Outside, the snow kept falling, and the house was warm, and no one left. The freeze broke the following week, the road cleared, and the boys went back to school. Eliza went to town for supplies on the same day, driving the wagon herself since Caleb had fence work to get to, and on her way down the main street she passed Margaret Holt coming out of the millinery. Margaret stopped. She looked at Eliza on the wagon seat, the plain coat, the direct gaze, The fact of her still being there after 7 weeks when the established wisdom had been that she wouldn't last 5 days. "Miss Marlowe," Margaret said. "Mrs. Holt." A pause. "I heard," Margaret said with careful precision, "about the Henderson situation." "Mrs. Henderson and I have an understanding," Eliza said. "I see." Another pause. "And how are the boys?" Eliza looked at her, at the composed, well-dressed face, the particular arrangement of courtesy over something less courteous. "They're working hard," Eliza said. "I'll tell them you asked." She clicked the horse forward and drove on down the street, and she did not look back to see how Margaret received that, because it didn't matter how Margaret received it. What mattered was that it was true. The boys were working hard. That was the thing she kept coming back to, through all the rest of it. The tensions with the town, Birch and his land ambitions, the cold and the isolation, and the 100 small daily difficulties of a household trying to rebuild itself. Underneath all of it, steady and persistent and surprisingly strong, that was the fact she trusted. The boys were working hard, and she intended to be there to see what they built. The petition arrived on a Thursday. Caleb brought it in from town, folded in his coat pocket, and set it on the kitchen table without a word. He'd gone in for feed and come back with that. And the way he set it down, not dropped, not placed with any care either, just put there, the way you put down something you don't know what to do with, told Eliza everything she needed to know about how he'd found out. She unfolded it while he stood at the window looking out at the yard. It was 2 pages, written in the careful copperplate of someone who understood that formal language makes things harder to argue with. The heading read, "Petition to the Red Hollow School Board regarding the welfare of students and the fitness of certain family arrangements." Below that, 12 signatures. Margaret Holt's was first. Gerald Birch's was third. Between them was the signature of Reverend Calder, which surprised her briefly until she remembered that Calder owed Birch 2 years of unpaid debts on his church building, and that money had a way of clarifying a man's civic convictions. The body of the petition was careful not to say anything it could be held directly accountable for. It spoke of concerns about the educational environment, of reports from unnamed parents about incidents involving the Whitaker boys, of the responsibility of the board to consider the welfare of all students. It referenced the fire in the schoolhouse, the one Ethan hadn't started, as an unresolved incident. It used the word unsuitable 3 times and welfare 5 times. At the bottom, in slightly different ink, as though added after the primary drafting, "We therefore request that the board convene a formal hearing to determine whether current arrangements at the Whitaker household meet the standards required for children attending Red Hollow School." Eliza read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and set it back on the table. "When's the hearing?" she asked. 3 weeks, Caleb said, still at the window. "First Friday of January." The boys were at school. It was just the 2 of them in the kitchen, and the particular silence of a house that knows something has changed. "Cole's going to find out," Caleb said. "Yes." "He'll take it worse than Ethan. Ethan'll go cold. Cole'll—" He stopped. "I don't want them to know before they have to." "They should know," Eliza said. He turned from the window. "They're children. Ethan is 14 and he's already worked out half of what Birch is doing with the land. Cole has been listening at doors and mapping property lines." She kept her voice even, not hard. "They know something is happening. Not telling them the shape of it doesn't protect them. It just means they find out from someone else, and then they don't trust that you trusted them." Caleb looked at her. "You've known my sons for 2 months, he said. "I have," she said. "And I'm telling you what I've seen in 2 months." It was not a comfortable silence that followed. It was the silence of a man who is being told something true by someone who has earned the standing to say it, and who is finding that standing both legitimate and irritating. "After supper," he said finally. "I'll tell them after supper." He did. He sat them down at the cleared table, the petition in front of him, and he told them plainly and without softening what it said and what the hearing was. Eliza sat at the far end of the table and did not speak. Ethan went still. Not frozen. Still, the way a person goes still when they are processing something by shutting down every non-essential function and running the important one at full capacity. His face closed and his hands were flat on the table. Cole's face went through 6 things in 4 seconds and landed on something that was not quite any of them. Not the smirk, not the bright deflection, not the practiced indifference. It landed on something younger and plainer, something that had not yet learned to put a performance in front of it. They're saying we shouldn't be at school, Cole said. They're saying they have questions about... That's what it means, Cole said. They're saying we don't belong there. Caleb didn't answer that because there was no answer that would have been honest and less painful at the same time. Noah had not said a word. Eliza looked at him. His face was perfectly composed in the way of a child who has gone somewhere internal and shut the door. She'd learned to be more worried about that expression on Noah than about either of his brother's more visible reactions. Is this because of what Harlan Birch said? Ethan asked. He directed it at Eliza, not at his father. Partly, she said. And the land? Caleb looked at his son. Something moved through his expression. The same thing that always moved through it when he was confronted with evidence of how clearly Ethan saw things. Pride and pain in the same motion. Partly, Caleb said. Cole had been staring at the petition since his father laid it on the table. Now he reached out and turned it so he could read it right side up. He read the whole thing, moving his lips slightly the way he did when he was reading seriously rather than performing at reading. 12 signatures, he said. Birch got Calder. That's the church vote. He was talking to himself as much as anyone. And Holt got the millinery women and at least one board member. That's Mrs. Fenn's handwriting on line 8. He looked up. Who's on the board besides Fenn? Cole, Caleb said. I'm asking because it matters, Cole said. Not sharp, not performing, direct. If we know who's on the board, we know who they've already talked to and who they haven't. Eliza looked at Caleb. He had the expression of a man being outthought by his 11-year-old, which was not an entirely comfortable experience, but was a more useful one than he seemed to realize. Fenn, Archer, and Delaney, Caleb said. Cole nodded slowly. Archer bought his seed from us last season, he said, before you switched suppliers. He looked at Eliza. Is that useful? It might be, she said. Ethan finally spoke. What are we supposed to do between now and January? Go to school, Eliza said. Do your work. Don't give anyone anything to point to. His jaw tightened. You want us to just... I want you to understand, she said, that the best thing you can do for this fight is make sure the picture they're trying to paint of you doesn't match what people actually see when they look at you. She held his gaze. That's not surrender. That's strategy. He didn't like it, but he thought about it, and she could see him thinking about it, and after a moment he gave a short nod. Noah stood up from the table, pushed his chair in with both hands, and went upstairs without a word. Caleb started to call after him. Eliza shook her head slightly. Caleb stopped. She went up 10 minutes later. Noah was in his room, which was spare and neat in the way of a child who controls the things he can control, sitting on the edge of his bed looking at the floor. She knocked on the open door. Can I come in? He looked up and nodded. She sat in the chair by his small desk. Outside the window, the December dark had come down full, and the wind was moving. Say what you're thinking, she said. He looked at the floor again. A long moment passed. If they make us leave school, he said, does that mean you leave too? She hadn't expected that to be the first thing. She was quiet for a second, making sure she answered it right rather than fast. My being here isn't connected to the school, she said. I work for your father. But if they make it bad enough, he might not be able to keep you. He said it so carefully, the reasoning so precise, and he was 8 years old. Noah, she said, I made an arrangement with your father. I don't break arrangements. Miss Tally made arrangements, he said quietly. She didn't know Miss Tally. That had been one of the early ones, before the 3 this month, before Eliza arrived. But she understood what the name meant in his mouth. I know the others left, she said. I understand why that's what you're expecting. He didn't answer. I can't promise you nothing gets harder, she said. I can tell you that harder isn't the same as leaving. He sat with that. Outside, something, a shutter, a loose board, knocked against the house in the wind. Okay, he said finally. Small word, big work behind it. She stood up. Get some sleep. She went back downstairs and she sat at the kitchen table after Caleb had gone out to do the last barn check. And she stayed with the thing that Noah had said and the thing that it required of her. She'd told him harder wasn't the same as leaving. She'd meant it. But meaning it and managing what was coming were two different problems, and she was clear-eyed enough to know that one was easier than the other. She started with what she knew how to do, which was find out more than she currently had. The school board records were public, which most people in Red Hollow didn't know because most people had no occasion to need them, and the board did not advertise the fact. She knew because she'd spent 3 years keeping accounts for a school district in Ohio, and one of the things she'd learned was that the official record of an institution and the institution's actual operation were sometimes very different things, and that the gap between them was where useful information lived. She went to the town hall on a Tuesday when the boys were at school, and Caleb was riding fence. The clerk was a young man named Dooley, who had the distracted air of someone perpetually working on two things at once and not finishing either. She asked to see the minutes of the school board meetings from the previous 2 years. He found them after some searching and set them on the counter with the mild suspicion of someone who isn't sure he should be doing this, but can't identify a specific rule against it. She took a table in the corner and worked through them for 3 hours. The fire in the schoolhouse, October 2 years prior. The minutes recorded it as cause undetermined. Not Ethan, undetermined. Someone had been careful to keep it vague, which meant someone had known from the start that it wasn't Ethan and had preferred the useful ambiguity to the clear record. The board member who'd moved to table further investigation, a man named Warren, who had sold his property to Gerald Birch the following spring. The water rights dispute, 18 months ago. The board had voted 2-1 against supporting Caleb's complaint to the county. The dissenting vote was Archer. The minutes recorded the majority's reasoning as insufficient documentation, which was the kind of language that meant, we don't want to deal with this. She worked through the attendance records, the complaint filings, the notes from the previous hearings about the Whitaker boys that she hadn't known existed until now. 3 separate hearings in 2 years, smaller ones, less formal, but hearings nonetheless. Each time the complaint had been logged, addressed briefly, and resolved in the board's minutes with language like family agrees to address concerns or matter referred for monitoring. Each time Caleb had apparently agreed to whatever was asked without pushing back, because he was a man dealing with too many things at once, and the path of least resistance was the only path he could see. She copied what she needed in her own hand, returned the records to Dooley, and walked back out into the December cold thinking about the gap between what was in those records and what had actually happened, and what could be done about it. The storm came on a Sunday night at the end of December, 11 days before the hearing. She'd been watching the sky all day, the particular greenish tinge to the western clouds. By mid-afternoon, the way the wind shifted direction twice in an hour, the restlessness in the animals that Ethan noticed first and mentioned at supper with the matter-of-fact observation of a boy who has grown up reading weather the way other children read books. "Bad one coming," he said. The horses were moving all afternoon. Caleb looked out the window at the dark. "Could pass north." "Could," Ethan said, in a tone that meant he didn't think so. It didn't pass north. It hit at 2 in the morning with the full committed violence of a plains winter storm, wind that went from present to roaring in the space of 10 minutes, snow that was less falling than being thrown, the kind of cold that gets through walls and under doors and makes the house itself seem to pull inward. Eliza woke to the sound of something large giving way outside and was up and dressed before she was fully conscious of having made that decision. She came out into the hall and nearly walked into Ethan, who was already pulling on his coat. "The barn," he said. "The north side. I heard the roof section go." "Wake your father." He was already moving. She pulled on her own coat and her boots, took the lamp from the hall table and went out into it. The cold hit her like a door swung hard. The snow was nearly horizontal in the wind, the lamp immediately threatened by the gusts, and the yard that she'd walked every day for 2 months was both familiar and completely transformed. The usual landmarks swallowed up, the distance to the barn uncertain in the dark, and the blowing white. She walked with one hand out ahead and the other shielding the lamp and found the barn by the sound of the animals, which had gone from restless to frightened. The north wall of the barn's upper loft section had partially failed. A section of older timber had given at the joint, pulling the roof with it, and the horses in the 2 north stalls were in the corner furthest from the damage, pressed together, wide-eyed and trembling. The stored grain and hay on the north side of the loft was exposed to the sky. Not all of it, but enough. The winter supply. The feed that would take the animals through January and February. She set the lamp on a post hook out of the wind and started moving. She wasn't sure what she was going to do exactly. The timber was beyond her alone and the grain sacks were heavy, but she had the general intention of doing something rather than waiting, and she started with moving the horses from the damaged stalls to the two empty ones on the south side, which meant getting close to two terrified horses in the middle of the night in a half-collapsed structure, which was not something she had extensive experience in. She was leading the second one, badly, when Cole appeared at her elbow. He had not stopped to dress properly. Coat over his nightshirt, boots unlaced. His face in the lamplight was white and sharp with the specific alertness of someone who has skipped from sleep to emergency without the usual interval. "You're doing it wrong," he said, taking the lead rope from her without preamble. He spoke to the horse in a low, continuous murmur, a kind of running inventory of calm that she hadn't known he had, and the horse, who had been pulling against her, settled within 30 seconds. She did not argue about technique. She moved to the grain sacks. The grain sacks were burlap, 50 pounds each, and there were 11 on the north side of the loft that were going to be ruined by the snow if they stayed where they were. She got the first one onto her shoulder, and her knees informed her immediately that 50 pounds on an icy barn floor in the dark was its own specific category of problem. Noah appeared on the loft ladder. He'd gotten dressed fully, even in the chaos, and he looked down at her for a moment with his large, serious eyes, and then climbed the rest of the way up and began pushing sacks toward the ladder. "Easier to slide them down," he said, which was correct. She managed the landing end. He managed the pushing. They had 4 down when Caleb and Ethan arrived together from the house with a rope and a timber and the general energy of 2 people who have assessed a situation in transit and arrived with a plan already in motion. Caleb took one look at what Eliza and the boys had already done and said nothing, just nodded once and moved to the structural problem with Ethan. They worked with the ease of people who had done physical work together before. Not graceful, not efficient by any standard, but effective, each one covering the gap the other left, the rope going up to secure the failed section against further collapse. The timber braced in from below. Cole had all the horses sorted and the south stall latched. He was leaning on the stall door watching his father and Ethan with the rope when Noah slid the last grain sack to the floor. "Good," Cole said, to no one in particular. Or to everyone. She wasn't sure. The roof section held, not repaired, not good as new, but held through the night against further failure. They got the animals settled. They covered the remaining exposed grain with canvas from the equipment corner. They stood in the relative shelter of the south side of the barn, with the storm screaming outside and a lamp burning between them, and Caleb looked at his 3 sons in the unsteady light. Eliza looked at them too. She thought about the petition folded in the kitchen drawer. She thought about the words unsuitable and welfare and the 12 signatures and the hearing 11 days away. She thought about what a room full of people who had already decided what these 3 boys were would say if they could see them right now. Not the narrative, not the shaped story, but the actual thing. Cole with the horses, certain and competent and kind, in a way he'd spent months hiding under sarcasm. Noah at the top of a ladder in a blizzard, solving the sack problem with the lateral thinking of someone who sees the efficient answer first. Ethan working rope and timber with his father, not saying anything, just doing it, holding his end. The same children everyone called hopeless, and what they had actually done was save the winter supply. Caleb put his hand on Ethan's shoulder. He didn't say anything. Ethan didn't pull away. They went inside in a group, the storm at their backs. And Eliza made coffee because something warm was needed, and she needed the task to put distance between herself and what she was feeling, which was a specific kind of fierce protectiveness that she hadn't expected and didn't entirely know what to do with. The coffee was too strong. Cole drank his without complaint. The barn took most of the next week to properly repair. 2 neighbors came without being asked, the Ostroms from 2 miles south, who owed Caleb nothing but came with timber and tools on Monday morning and stayed through midday. Mrs. Henderson sent her eldest son with rope and a covered dish. Nothing was said about the petition, or the hearing, or the 12 signatures. Work was done. Food was left on the porch. People went home. Eliza noticed this. She thought it mattered, and she filed it carefully. She also filed the look on Cole's face when the Ostrom brothers arrived. The brief, unguarded surprise of a boy who had concluded that the world operated on a simple accounting of who had power and who didn't, encountering evidence that it sometimes didn't. She had one more thing to do before the hearing, and she did it on the Thursday before, leaving the boys with Caleb and driving the wagon into town alone in the morning cold. She went to the land registry first, the same clerk's office, the same records principal. It took 2 hours and considerable patience with the filing system, which had been organized by someone who had their own logic and hadn't shared it with anyone. But she found it. The water rights complaint, 18 months ago. Caleb's complaint, insufficient documentation, the board had said. But in the registry, the original survey map from 1871 showed the creek running through the north corner of the Whitaker property before the birch line. A later survey, filed 1879, the year before the dispute, showed the line redrawn. The surveyor's name on the 1879 document was a man named Croft. She knew that name. It had appeared in the board minutes, attached to the Warren property sale. She copied everything. Her hand was steady, and her mind was working fast and cold, the way it worked when a problem resolved itself from complicated to clear. The second stop was Archer's. He was the board member who'd voted against the majority on the water rights. He was a spare, quiet man in his 60s who ran a small hardware business on the south end of the main street, and who, she'd observed in her months in Red Hollow, had the manner of someone who says little because he is choosing his words rather than lacking them. She told him what she had found. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You understand," he said, "that bringing this at the hearing puts you directly in front of Birch." "I understand." "He's not a man who handles it well when someone makes him look dishonest." "I imagine not," Eliza said. "But the record is the record. I copied it from the public files. He can be whatever he likes about it." Archer looked at her across his cluttered counter. He had the particular gaze of an old man who has watched a great many things happen in a community and has learned to read whether the person in front of him will hold or fold under pressure. "You're not from here," he said. "No." "Why are you doing this?" She'd been asked variations of this question since October. She still didn't have an answer that was complete, and she'd stopped trying to manufacture one. "Because it's the right thing to do and someone needs to do it," she said. "And the boys don't deserve what's being done to them." Archer was quiet again for a moment. "Fen will vote with Birch," he said. "She always has. But Delaney is an honest man who doesn't like being made to feel he's been used. If you can show him the survey discrepancy, he'll see what it means." He paused. "I'll make sure he has time to look at it before the meeting starts." "Thank you," Eliza said. She drove back to the ranch in the early dark of a January afternoon, the cold settling in earnest, her notes folded in her coat pocket. The lane to the Whitaker house came into view around the long curve, the lamp already lit in the kitchen window, the yellow light warm against the blue-gray dusk. She had 6 days. She had the records. She had Archer. She had the Ostrom brothers and Mrs. Henderson's son showing up with timber and rope without being asked. She had 3 boys who had held a barn together in a blizzard and didn't know yet that what they'd done was evidence of exactly the thing that was being disputed. What she didn't have was certainty. She'd never had that. She'd learned in 34 years of being told she wasn't enough that certainty was a luxury and competence was what you built in its absence. She pulled the wagon up to the barn. Ethan appeared at the barn door to take the horse. He'd started doing this some weeks ago without being asked, adding it to his rota of tasks the way he added most things, silently and completely. "Everything all right?" he asked. She handed him the reins. "Working on it." He looked at her with those clear, too-old eyes. He didn't ask more than that, and she didn't offer more, and they both went about their business in the early winter dark, the lamp in the kitchen window holding steady against the cold. The 6 days between her visit to Archer and the hearing were the longest Eliza had spent on the Whitaker ranch, and that included the snow week, when they'd all been locked inside together with nowhere to put their nerves. The boys knew the hearing was coming. They'd known since the night Caleb told them, and they'd handled it the way each of them handled most things. Ethan by working harder and speaking less, Cole by making jokes that were sharper than usual and laughing at them alone, Noah by building things. He had constructed, in the 6 days before the hearing, a small wooden box with a fitted lid and dovetail corners that were not quite perfect but were close enough that Eliza had picked it up and turned it in her hands for a full minute before setting it down. She didn't sleep well. This was not something she acknowledged to anyone in the house, because they had enough to carry without adding her anxiety to the load. But the nights were long, and her mind kept working through the materials she'd copied, the board members' names and histories, the gaps in the record that she intended to turn into the record's most important contents. She reviewed everything twice each night and once each morning. She knew the survey dates by heart. She knew the wording of the original complaint. She knew which signatures on the petition were strategic and which were social, people signing because Margaret had asked and declining Margaret was expensive, and which of those might shift under sufficient clarity about what they'd actually signed. On Wednesday, 2 days before the hearing, Margaret Holt came to the ranch. Eliza saw her from the kitchen window. The good horse, the neat buggy, the particular uprightness of a woman who considers her posture a form of argument. She wiped her hands and went to the door before Margaret could knock. Margaret stood on the porch with her hands folded in her good wool gloves and looked at Eliza with the expression of someone who has arrived prepared for resistance and is not going to be deterred by it. "Mrs. Holt," Eliza said, "Miss Marlowe, I'd like to speak with you." "Come in." She put coffee on because it was cold and because having something to do with her hands was useful. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and removed her gloves finger by finger and set them on the table beside her. And when Eliza set the cups down, she looked at her with a directness that was the first honest thing Eliza had seen from her. "I want to be plain with you," Margaret said. "I'd appreciate that." The petition was Gerald Birch's idea. He brought it to me as a matter of community concern, and I agreed to support it because— She paused. The pause was not theatrical. It was the pause of a woman choosing between the version she'd been telling herself and a more accurate one. Because I agreed with the general position, that the situation here was unmanaged and causing problems for other families in town. "And now," Eliza said, "now I've had occasion to reconsider." Another pause. "Mrs. Henderson came to see me. She told me about the boys coming to her door, about what they said and how they said it." She looked at her coffee cup. "Mrs. Henderson is not a woman who is easily impressed, and she was not unimpressed." Eliza said nothing. "I also spoke with Mrs. Ostrom," Margaret continued, "about the barn, about what happened in the storm." She looked up. "You should understand that I have spent 3 months believing a particular version of what was happening in this house. I am telling you that version may have been incomplete. It was as close to an apology as Margaret Holt was probably capable of producing, and Eliza received it for what it was rather than what it wasn't. "The petition has 12 signatures," Eliza said. "I'm aware. Can you reach the people you know personally before Friday?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Some of them. Not Birch's people, but some." "That's useful," Eliza said. Margaret looked at her, a long, measuring look that Eliza held without difficulty. "You're not what I expected," Margaret said. "When Whitaker brought you in, I thought—" "I know what you thought," Eliza said, not unkindly. "It doesn't matter now." The older woman's chin came up slightly, the habitual dignity, and then something in it relaxed. "No," she said. "I suppose it doesn't." She left 30 minutes later, and Eliza stood at the window and watched the buggy go back down the lane, and she thought, not an ally, but not an obstacle. And in this situation, those are closer to the same thing than they usually are. What? Caleb found her that evening in the front room after the boys were in bed, sitting with her copies of the survey records spread on the small table beside the lamp. He'd come in from the barn and stopped in the doorway the way he sometimes did, not quite entering, watching her work for a moment before she noticed him. "What is all that?" he asked. She told him. She laid it out in the order she'd assembled it: the original 1871 survey, the 1879 redraft, the name connecting the redraft to the Warren sale, the chain of relationships that ran from that transaction through to Birch and the board majority and the water rights defeat 18 months ago. She laid it out plainly, without editorializing, because the facts were sufficient, and she'd learned that Caleb responded to facts better than to interpretation. He stood over the table and read what she put in front of him. He read slowly and carefully, the way he did everything, and the only thing that changed in his face was a tightening around his eyes that she'd come to recognize as his version of something more visible in another man. "This survey," he said, "the 1879 one, this shifts the creek line onto his property." "Yes." "Which means the water rights complaint was legitimate. The documentation wasn't insufficient. The map they were using to dismiss it was itself the problem." He straightened up. He was quiet for a moment. "How did you find this?" "Public record. I asked to see the registry files and I read them." "I never—" He stopped. I had a lawyer look at it after the hearing. He said the documentation wasn't there. Did he check the 1871 survey? The look on his face answered that. The lawyer had taken the existing record at face value, which was what most people did, because most people assumed the existing record was the whole record. If Birch had someone redraw that survey, Caleb said, and his voice had gone to the flat, careful tone he used when he was very angry, that's fraud. It's a strong suggestion of fraud, Eliza said. Strong enough to require explanation. Strong enough that a board member who doesn't want to be associated with it will need to decide quickly which side he's on. Delaney, Caleb said. Archer is going to show him before the meeting. Caleb looked at her. He looked at the papers. He looked at her again. You've been doing this, he said. Not quite a question. Someone needed to. I should have been. He stopped. He put both hands on the table and leaned on them for a moment. I let them make me feel like the problem was the boys. Like if I could just get the boys right, the rest of it would settle. I wasn't looking at the rest of it. You were managing what you could see from where you were standing, Eliza said. That's not failure. It's just incomplete. He looked up at her. That's a generous reading. It's an accurate one. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp burned between them, the papers with their copied columns of names and dates and property lines, the evidence of something that had been done deliberately and badly and which had been allowed to stand for 18 months because no one had looked in the right place. At the hearing, he said, I don't want you standing up there alone with this. I'm not planning to be alone, she said, but I need to know you won't step in and try to manage it. When I stand up, I need to be able to say what I have to say without you intervening because you think it's going too far. He looked at her directly. You think I do that? I think you might want to protect me from the room, she said. I don't need protecting from the room. I need the room to hear what I have to say. Something moved through his face, something that wasn't quite what she'd expected, not offense, not resistance. Something that looked more like recognition, the particular expression of a man who has just understood something about the person in front of him that he hadn't fully understood before. All right, he said. And the boys, she said, I want them there. Eliza, I know, but I want them there. Not to perform for the board, not to be displayed, because they should be present when something this important is decided about their lives, and because I think there's something they need to say, and they should have the chance to say it. She met his gaze steadily. You can tell me no. It's your decision, but I'm telling you what I think. He considered it, not briefly. He was not a man who made quick decisions about things that mattered, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him over 3 months, and which was not a flaw. All right, he said again. She gathered the papers and organized them back into their order. He watched her do it. You've been here 3 months, he said. Almost exactly. Those first days, when you sat at the table and they tested everything you did, I kept thinking you'd be gone by the weekend. I know, she said. Why weren't you? She thought about it honestly. Because leaving would have meant that everyone who said I should leave was right, and I had a suspicion they weren't. He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him. Not a full one, brief, reluctant, but real. That's a thin reason, he said, repeating her own words from months ago back at her. It's a solid one, she said, the other half of the exchange. The thin reasons are the ones that sound better. He said goodnight and went to bed, and she sat for a while longer in the lamplight with the papers and the sound of the wind outside and the particular quiet of a house where 3 children were sleeping and morning was coming. Chut. Friday arrived without ceremony. Gray sky, hard cold. The road to town rutted and frozen under the wagon wheels. Eliza rode in the front with Caleb. The 3 boys sat in the back, Ethan with his arms crossed and his eyes on the passing land, Cole very still in a way that was not his natural state and therefore more alarming than movement. Noah between his brothers with his hands in his lap. Nobody talked much. There was nothing to say that would make the cold shorter or the road smoother, and they all understood that. The town hall was the largest interior space in Red Hollow, a wood-framed building on the main street that served as meeting room, polling station, and general venue for the community's occasions, good and bad. When they arrived, the hitching posts out front were already crowded with horses and rigs, more people than the petition alone would bring. Word had gotten out, the way word always did in a small town, spreading from person to person along the invisible lines of relationship and interest that connected every household to every other. Eliza got down from the wagon and looked at the building and took a breath of cold air. Inside was warm from the press of bodies. The board sat at a long table at the front. Fenn on the left, Delaney in the center, Archer on the right. Fenn had the settled expression of a woman who had made up her mind. Archer's face gave nothing. Delaney looked like a man who had been given information he was still working through, his expression not hostile, but serious, carrying something. The Birch contingent was easy to locate. Gerald Birch in the second row, large and composed, the particular composure of a man who controls the room before anything is said in it, who has organized his confidence around the assumption that the outcome is already settled. Beside him, Harlan, who was doing his best to arrange himself the same way and not quite managing it. Margaret Holt was near the back, which was notable. She had not taken her usual position in the front third of the room. She was sitting with the Ostroms and two women Eliza recognized from the Ladies' Society, not with the petition signatories. Eliza noted it and moved on. Caleb led them to seats on the left side. Eliza sat beside him. The boys settled in the row behind, and she heard Cole say something very quietly to Ethan that she couldn't catch, and Ethan's low response, and then silence. Board Chairman Delaney called the meeting to order. He had a careful voice, a man who chose his words the way Archer chose them, with awareness that public speech had consequences. He summarized the petition. He was precise about it, not embellishing, not diminishing. He said the board had received a formal petition from 12 residents requesting a hearing into the suitability of current arrangements for the Whitaker children's education and welfare. He said the board's role today was to hear from relevant parties and determine whether any action was warranted. Birch's lawyer spoke first. He was a man named Prewitt, who had come from Dodge City, which was itself a statement about how seriously Birch was taking this, or how seriously he wanted it to appear he was taking it. Prewitt had the practiced, fluid delivery of a man who does this for money, and has done it enough that he no longer needs to mean any of it. He laid out the case with considerable skill. The fire in the schoolhouse presented as fact despite the board's own record of undetermined cause. The incident with the Henderson boy, Cole hitting him, which Cole had done, though the context was again absent. 3 governesses in a single month. The general assertion that a household managed this badly represented a burden on the school and a potential harm to the other students. He named Eliza directly. He called her an inexperienced and unsuitable caretaker whose own limited background and lack of formal credentials raised questions about the board's responsibility to the children in her care. He said it pleasantly, the way Prewitt said everything, as though the words were simply the natural shape of the facts rather than choices made to cause damage. Eliza did not move. She'd expected something of this kind, and she'd spent part of the previous night deciding how she wanted to feel about it, which was not particularly. The substance of what Prewitt was saying was false, and false things said in a convincing manner were still false, and she'd sit with that while the room processed it. Beside her, she felt Caleb's hand tighten on his knee. "Easy," she said, very low. He didn't answer, but his hand relaxed. Fenn spoke next from the board table, asking Prewitt a series of questions that were clearly supportive, the kind of questions that allow a witness to expand on points already made rather than challenge them. She did it with practiced politeness. Delaney listened without expression. When Prewitt finished, Delaney asked if anyone wished to speak in response. Eliza stood up. The room shifted. That particular shift of attention when a room full of people focuses on one person and the air changes quality. She didn't look at Birch. She didn't look at Prewitt. She looked at Delaney because he was the one that mattered today. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "I'd like to address several specific things in what we just heard, and then I'd like to present some information that I believe the board needs to see." Delaney nodded. "Go ahead, Miss Marlowe." "The schoolhouse fire. Mr. Prewitt stated it as an established fact involving Ethan Whitaker. The board's own minutes from October 2 years ago record the cause as undetermined. I have a copy of those minutes." She set it on the table. The copied page, the exact language. Ethan Whitaker has never been formally charged or even formally suspected in any documented record. The version Mr. Prewitt presented today is not the record. It's a different story someone has been telling alongside the record. Fenn's mouth tightened. Delaney looked at the page. The Henderson incident. Cole Whitaker struck Robert Henderson. That is true. What is not in Mr. Pruitt's account is that Robert Henderson had spent 3 consecutive days directing sustained verbal cruelty at the youngest Whitaker child, who was 7 years old at the time. I spoke with Mrs. Henderson personally. She is aware of the full context. She heard something in the room behind her, a small movement, a changed breath. She didn't turn around. The 3 governesses who left this past fall. That is also true. I will not pretend otherwise. What I'll tell you is what I've observed in the 3 months I have been in that house. Those boys are not problems. They are children who have spent 3 years in grief without adequate support, in a community that decided what they were and stopped looking at what they actually are. She took a breath. I want to tell you something specific. 11 days ago, in the storm, a section of the Whitaker barn roof failed in the middle of the night. The winter feed was at risk, the supply that would take those animals through January and February. Caleb Whitaker woke and went out. Do you know what else went out into that storm? She paused, not for effect, but because she needed the moment. His 3 sons, without being woken, without being asked. Ethan secured the structure. Cole settled 5 panicked horses in the dark and didn't lose one. Noah, who is 8 years old, was at the top of a loft ladder in a blizzard moving 50-pound grain sacks because he'd worked out the most efficient way to handle them, and he just did it. She looked at the board. The children in this room, who Mr. Pruitt calls unsuitable and dangerous, saved their family's winter supply in the middle of the night because they knew it needed doing. I would like someone to explain to me what exactly the word unsuitable is meant to describe. The room was very quiet. She picked up the second set of papers. Now, I'd like to address something else, something that I suspect is the actual reason this petition exists. Birch, in the second row, did not move, but she felt the stillness of a man who has just understood that something unexpected is happening. 18 months ago, Caleb Whitaker brought a water rights complaint before this board. It was dismissed on the grounds of insufficient documentation. I went to the land registry this week, and I looked at the original survey documentation from 1871 and compared it to a revised survey filed in 1879. She set the copied pages on the table in front of Delaney. The 1871 survey places the creek running through the north corner of the Whitaker property. The 1879 survey redraws that line. The surveyor named on the 1879 document is a man named Croft, who was also involved in the property transaction by which a man named Warren sold land to Gerald Birch the following spring. She heard it then. Not silence, but the sound that comes when a room full of people understand simultaneously that they are watching something real happen. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "I'm not here to make legal accusations. What I'm saying is that the documentation the board found insufficient 18 months ago was not insufficient. The map being used to dismiss it was itself in question. That is a matter that I believe this board, and potentially the county, should look at with fresh eyes." She looked directly at Delaney. "And I believe it has direct relevance to why this petition has appeared now, targeting these specific children at this specific moment." Delaney was looking at the papers. Archer was looking at the papers. Fenn was looking at Birch. Birch stood up. "Mr. Chairman," he said. His voice was steady, the voice of a man with practice at being the largest presence in a room. "I'd like to object to the introduction of materials that have no relevance to the stated purpose of this hearing." "The relevance," Eliza said, before Delaney could respond, "is that this hearing exists because the petition exists. And the petition exists because Caleb Whitaker has declined to sell the north acres of his property, which contain water access that Mr. Birch's operation requires. These children are being used as leverage in a land dispute. That is the relevance." She said it clearly and completely, and then she stopped talking because there was nothing to add to it, and she knew the difference between the moment to speak and the moment to let a room sit with what had been said. The room sat with it. Birch's lawyer started to stand. Delaney held up a hand and Pruitt stopped, which told Eliza something useful about where Delaney was landing. "Mr. Birch," Delaney said, "the survey discrepancy Miss Marlowe has identified. Do you have a response to that?" "The documents she's referencing are being taken out of context," Birch said. "The 1879 survey was a legitimate. Do you have the original surveyor's documentation, the field notes, the measurements?" A pause. Not long, but present. "I'd need to have my people locate that material," Birch said. "I see." Delaney looked down at the pages Eliza had set before him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Fenn and Archer. "I'd like to take a 15-minute recess." The 15 minutes happened in the anteroom off the main hall, where the board went behind a closed door, and the room rearranged itself into the clusters that naturally form when people are waiting for something important and don't know what to say to each other. Caleb came to stand beside Eliza. He didn't say anything immediately. He'd been very still through the whole of her presentation, holding to what he'd promised, not intervening, not trying to manage it. The look on Birch's face, he said finally quietly, "When you put those papers down, I saw it. I've been in disputes with that man for 18 months, and I never—" He stopped. "I didn't know about Croft. I didn't know the surveyor was connected to him." "You didn't have time to look," she said. "You were managing everything else." "You didn't have time either." "I made time." He looked at her. There was something in his face that had not been there before. Not the bone-deep exhaustion that had been his baseline since the first day she'd seen him in the ladies' society meeting room. Not the tightly controlled worry of the weeks since the petition arrived. Something that looked more like a man who had been holding a weight alone for long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone else's hands on it. "Eliza," he said. She looked at him. He seemed to be working towards something and not quite arriving, the way he sometimes did when whatever he was thinking had more feeling behind it than words he trusted. "Later," she said. "Say it later." He nodded. They stood together and waited. The boys were across the room. Ethan was at the window looking out at the street. Cole was sitting on a bench with his elbows on his knees, and Eliza could see from here that his hands were not quite steady and that he was not performing anything. The bright deflection, the ready sarcasm, the armor. He'd left all of it somewhere in the main room when she stood up. Noah was beside him. He was not building anything. His hands were still in his lap, and he was watching the door to the board's room with the focused attention of someone who does not want to miss the moment it opens. And then the door opened. Delaney came out first. He looked at the room, at Caleb, at Eliza, with the measured expression of a man who has made a decision and is standing behind it. "If everyone will come back in," he said. They filed back into the main room. The board resumed their seats. Birch had returned to his row, but the composition of his face had changed. The large, settled composure was still there, but it was working harder than before. Delaney spoke without preamble. "The board has considered the materials presented today. With regard to the petition's central question, the welfare and educational suitability of the Whitaker children, the board finds no sufficient grounds for the actions requested." He looked at the room with the deliberate quality of someone making sure everyone understood that he knew what he was saying. "The incidents cited in the petition do not, on the evidence presented today, support a finding of unsuitability. The board will take no action against the children's enrollment or against the current household arrangements." Fenn's expression did not change. She'd lost this and she knew it, and she would manage that in her own way and in her own time. "Additionally," Delaney said, "the board will be requesting that the County Land Registry conduct a formal review of the 1879 survey documentation referenced today. This is a separate matter from the petition, but it is a matter the board considers relevant to the interests of the community." Birch was very still. "This hearing is concluded," Delaney said. The room moved, not all at once, not dramatically, but with the particular uneven motion of people recalibrating, turning to each other, the release of held breath in a crowd. Someone behind Eliza said something she couldn't catch. Caleb had his hand briefly on her arm, brief, firm, not elaborate. Cole made a sound. She turned to look at him. He was not crying. He would not have wanted her to think he was, and he wasn't, quite. But his face had collapsed out of all its practiced arrangements into something much younger and plainer, and his jaw was set so hard she could see it from where she stood, and his eyes were bright with something that had nowhere to go. Ethan put his hand on the back of Cole's neck, once, firm, and then dropped it, and went back to looking at the room, but the gesture had been there, and both of them knew it. Noah looked at Eliza, just that. Looked at her, straight and steady, with those large, serious eyes that took everything in and gave nothing back until they were ready. And then he gave a small nod. It was the nod of a child who has waited to see if the thing they feared would happen was actually going to happen, and it hadn't, and now he was acknowledging that fact and moving forward into whatever came next. It was one of the most composed things she'd ever seen from an 8-year-old, and it made something tighten in her chest that she kept off her face with some effort. She nodded back. They left before most of the room. Caleb made one brief exchange with Archer, a handshake, a few words that she was not close enough to hear, and then they went out into the cold of the main street. The boys were ahead of them, walking toward the wagon, and she could hear them, actually hear them, something she realized she was noting because it was different from the contained silences of the drive-in. Ethan said something low. Cole said something back that she caught only the end of, should have seen his face when she put the papers down. And Ethan made the sound that was his version of laughing. Noah, between them, looked up at his brothers, and his face was open in a way it almost never was outside the kitchen or the chicken coop. Caleb walked beside her. They were a few paces behind the boys, far enough for a kind of privacy on the open street. "That thing I was trying to say earlier," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. They were nearly at the wagon. "I don't have a good speech," he said. I've never been someone who has a good speech ready." "I know. I just want to say that I see what you've done. Not just today, the whole of it." He paused, and his voice when he continued was the careful, deliberate voice of a man who has decided to say something true and is making sure he says it accurately. "You came here and you stayed, and I don't think I understood when I was looking for someone that this was what I needed. Someone who would stay and look at the actual problem instead of just the surface of it." He looked at her sideways. "I'm not good at saying things like this." "You're doing all right," she said. "The boys," he said. "What you said in there about Noah in the loft. I didn't know he'd done that." "I came out and the thing was already half managed. He didn't want credit for it. He needs to know I saw it." "Then tell him," she said. "Tonight or tomorrow. Not in front of the others, just him. He needs to hear it from you specifically." Caleb nodded. He was thinking about it already. She could see. The specific, careful thinking he applied to things he understood mattered. They reached the wagon. Ethan had already untied the horse. Cole was in the back, doing something. She leaned to look and found he had Noah's wooden box in his hands, the dovetail-cornered one Noah had built during the long anxiety of the pre-hearing week. "Where'd this come from?" Cole said. "Noah brought it," Ethan said. Cole turned it in his hands, examining the joints. He ran a thumb along one of the corners with a seriousness that had nothing performing in it. "These corners," he said to Noah. "Did you figure out the angle yourself?" Noah, already in the wagon, looked at him. "Papa had a book with the measurements." "It's good," Cole said. Not as a compliment exactly, more as a statement of fact, the way he stated things he determined were true. He set the box down carefully. Noah looked at it for a moment, then he said quietly, "You can have it." Cole looked at him. "I made it while I was waiting," Noah said, "for something to do. You can have it if you want." Something moved through Cole's face that he did not manage in time to hide, not quite what Ethan had put on the back of his neck in the anteroom, but close in kind, the particular movement of feeling in a boy who has spent years making sure feeling stays where no one can point to it. "Okay," Cole said, "just that." He put the box inside his coat. Caleb helped Eliza up to the wagon seat, which he'd never done before and which she accepted without comment. They turned the horse and started back down the main street toward the east road, and the town of Red Hollow was on either side of them. The millinery, the feed mill, the town hall with its hitching posts still crowded, the people coming and going along the frozen street. She did not look for Margaret Holt. She didn't need to. She looked forward, at the road that led back to the ranch, and she thought about the night ahead. The fire in the kitchen stove, supper to make, Caleb finding the moment to speak to Noah alone. She thought about the survey review and what would come of it, the slow machinery of the county process, the longer fight that wasn't finished because one hearing had gone their way. She thought about 100 things she still didn't know how to do and 100 things she'd figure out. "Cold's getting worse," Ethan said from behind her. "It'll break by next week," Cole said. "Always does after a hard January." "You don't know that." "I know it more than you do." "That's not—" "Boys," Caleb said. Silence for a moment. Then, from Noah, very quietly, and addressed to no one in particular, "I'm hungry." Eliza looked out at the brown winter land opening up ahead of them as the town fell away, at the flat horizon and the gray sky and the pale light failing in the west. and she felt something she couldn't precisely name. Not triumph, not relief, not the particular satisfaction of having been right. Something simpler than all of those. Something that felt, in its plainest form, like being exactly where she was supposed to be. "We'll eat when we get home," she said. January gave way to February the way hard things sometimes do. Not all at once, not with any ceremony, but by degrees so small you didn't notice until one morning you stepped outside and the air had changed its quality, and you realized the worst of it was behind you. The county land registry review took 6 weeks. Eliza had not expected it to be fast, and it wasn't. The machinery of official process moves at its own pace, regardless of how clear the evidence is, and she'd spent enough time with institutional records to know that clarity and speed have no necessary relationship to each other. What mattered was that it had been set in motion, and that the man who had set it in motion was Delaney, whose credibility in the county seat was considerably more established than Gerald Birch had apparently accounted for. Birch's lawyer made 2 attempts to have the review suspended. Both were denied. This information came to Eliza through Archer, who had taken to stopping by the dry goods store on the occasional Tuesday when she was in town for supplies, and who delivered updates on the legal situation with the same economical precision he brought to everything. "Prewitt filed on procedural grounds," Archer said, the second Tuesday of February, setting his own items on the counter while Eliza settled her account. "Delaney's not moving." "Good," she said. "Birch is going to come out of this damaged," Archer said, "not destroyed. Men like that have too many relationships to be destroyed by one survey dispute. But damaged." "Damaged is sufficient," Eliza said. Archer looked at her with the measuring gaze she'd come to recognize as his version of approval. "The North Acres," he said. "Whitaker's going to want to get proper documentation of the water rights properly filed once the review concludes. Don't let him put it off." "I won't," she said. She drove back to the ranch in the thin February light, and she thought about what Archer had said. Men like that have too many relationships to be destroyed. And she thought about the nature of power in small places, how it was built from accumulated obligation and selective memory, and the willingness of people to look past certain things when the looking past benefited them. Birch would not be finished. He would recalibrate, find a new approach, channel his ambitions in a direction that caused someone else trouble. That was the honest outcome. What had changed was the Whitakers' position within it. They were no longer the isolated, manageable target. The petition had been defeated in a public room in front of most of the town, and the survey irregularity was on the county record. And those 2 facts together meant that moving against the Whitakers now carried a cost that hadn't existed in December. It wasn't justice exactly. It was something more practical than justice. A shift in the calculation, a new set of risks on Birch's side of the ledger. Eliza was realistic enough to value that for what it was, rather than what she might have wished it to be. The changes in the house happened the way the weather changed, not in dramatic declarations, but in degrees. Ethan started talking at supper. Not a lot, not with any sudden openness, but the silences he'd been using as walls became something more like pauses, spaces between things rather than barriers against them. He'd started taking the younger Henderson boy, 12, earnest, with a sincere interest in horses that Ethan could not quite pretend not to find worthwhile, out to the barn on Saturday mornings to learn the basic work of it. He hadn't announced this arrangement to anyone. It had simply appeared, the way Ethan's good impulses tended to appear, without preface or commentary, as accomplished facts. Cole had begun spending time with the survey map. Not the original. Eliza had found him an updated territorial map at the land office, official issue, and he'd tacked it to the wall of his room and was systematically working through it, cross-referencing with the account book he'd started keeping of his own devising, tracking what he called the actual numbers of the ranch operation. He'd found 2 places where Caleb's supplier pricing was unfavorable compared to alternatives he'd located in the map's annotated trade routes. He'd brought this to his father not as a complaint, but as a proposal, with the costs written out in his clear, small hand. Caleb had sat with it for a full evening. Then he'd said, "Where'd you learn to do this?" "The legal history book," Cole said, "and the surveying manual. And I asked Mr. Archer some questions." "When did you talk to Archer?" "When Miss Marlowe took me to town for the Henderson trees in November. You said I could go to the hardware store while she settled accounts." Caleb had looked at his son for a moment with the expression Eliza had come to understand was his specific version of being ambushed by love. The sudden confrontation with the fact of who his children actually were when nobody was managing their worst moments. He'd changed the supplier. Noah planted things. This was not new. Noah had always had the instinct for growing and building. But in February, he came to Eliza with a carefully drawn plan for the kitchen garden, the beds laid out in a grid on the back of a piece of brown paper, the plantings timed to the last frost date he'd calculated from the previous 3 years' weather patterns, as recorded in a notebook he'd apparently been keeping since he was 6. "Where did you get the frost dates?" Eliza asked, looking at the plan. "Mama kept a weather journal," he said. "It's in the chest in the hallway. I've been adding to it." She looked at the plan for a long time. "This is good work, Noah," she said. He accepted this with the small nod he gave to statements he'd decided were accurate. Then he said, "Can we start the beds in March?" "Yes," she said. "Show your father the plan tonight." He did. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with the brown paper spread before him and read it through, and when he looked up at Noah, standing at the other end of the table with his hands at his sides waiting for judgment, something happened in Caleb's face that he didn't try to hide. "Come here," he said. Noah came to him, and Caleb put an arm around his son's shoulders and pulled him against his side, and Noah did not pull away. He leaned in, the way children do when they've been waiting for something, and it finally arrives, quiet and complete. Eliza was in the doorway to the kitchen. She turned and went back to the stove. March brought mud and the Henderson trees. Cole and Ethan went on the first Saturday of the month, with shovels and the 2 saplings they'd sourced from a nurseryman 2 towns over on Cole's recommendation, and they spent most of the day at the Henderson property doing the work. Eliza did not go. This was deliberate. They were capable of doing it without her, and doing it without her was different from doing it with her watching. They came back in the late afternoon with dirt on their hands and faces, and Mrs. Henderson had sent a jar of preserved peaches back with them, which Cole carried with an expression Eliza chose not to comment on. He put it on the kitchen shelf. It stayed there, and as far as she could tell, he never opened it, and she understood that it was not there to be eaten. School had resumed without incident in January. The board's ruling had been sufficient, and whatever private conversations happened among the parents of Red Hollow in the weeks following, none of them produced a new challenge. Harlan Birch continued to exist in Ethan's general vicinity, and Ethan continued to exist in Harlan's, and there was nothing between them that could be called peace exactly, but there was a managed distance that both of them seemed to have calculated was in their interest. Cole had made, in the course of the spring semester, one actual friend. This was a boy named Marcus Delaney, the chairman's grandson, which was either coincidence or one of those connections that communities form after a shared experience reshapes the available relationships. Marcus was quiet and mathematical, and had the extremely specific interest in mechanical things that recognized a similar precision in Cole's thinking, and they had apparently arrived at mutual appreciation entirely on the basis of an argument about the correct method for calculating the load capacity of a grain wagon, which they'd both come down on the same side of, against the teacher. Cole did not describe this as friendship. He described it as a person who was not completely wrong about most things, which in Cole's vocabulary was warm praise. Ethan did not need a friend in the same way. He needed, and was slowly getting, the experience of being trusted with real work and having the results of that work matter. Caleb had started consulting him on the ranch decisions, not performing consultation, actually asking and actually taking the answers into account. Ethan was not easy with it at first. He'd been waiting for the consultation to turn out to be hollow, the trust to turn out to be a test. When it didn't, he was more unsettled by that than by the alternative, and it took another month before he started answering his father's questions without bracing for the correction that didn't come. Noah was a different matter. Noah had always been the one Eliza watched most carefully, because the quiet ones are where the important things go unnoticed if you let them. He talked more now. Not dramatically more. Not in ways that would have startled someone who knew him before Eliza arrived, but measurably, specifically more. He talked about the garden and the chickens and the weather journal. He talked about things he'd read. He talked occasionally about his mother, not with the careful avoidance he'd managed before, but with the natural ease of someone who has found that a person's memory can live in daily speech without requiring a dedicated and painful occasion for it. One evening in April, he said, unprompted, while they were doing the egg collection. Mama used to say that growing things was the most patient work there was, that you couldn't rush it, and you couldn't force it, and all you could do was show up every day and do what the plant needed. Eliza handed him the basket. She sounds like she was right about that, she said. She was right about most things, Noah said, with the plain certainty of a child who has decided this is simply true and sees no reason to qualify it. The weather journal, Eliza said. Does it help, keeping it? He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to real questions. It feels like she's still in it, he said. Like I'm adding to something she started. Like we're still doing it together, kind of. Eliza said nothing to that because there was nothing to add to it that wouldn't diminish it. They walked back to the house in the April evening, the sky going gold and violet over the flat land, the chickens settled, the first of Noah's kitchen garden beds showing the faint green rose of something beginning. The survey review concluded in late April. The county's determination was formal and precisely worded. The 1879 survey document contained irregularities inconsistent with standard practice, and the original 1871 survey was reinstated as the governing document for the property boundary in question. The water rights associated with the creek running through the north corner of the Whitaker property were formally confirmed. Archer sent word through the usual channel. Eliza read the letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, and then she set it down and sat with it for a moment. She hadn't been certain. She'd been confident because the evidence was clear and she'd put it in front of the right person. But confidence and certainty are different things, and she'd known all along that clear evidence and fair outcomes have no guaranteed relationship in the world as it actually operates. It had come out right. This time, for these people, the right thing had happened. She was not naive enough to think that was always how it went, which made it matter more rather than less. She put the letter where Caleb would find it when he came in from the morning work. He found it at noon. She was in the kitchen and she heard him come in, heard the particular silence that meant he was reading something, and then his footsteps to the kitchen doorway. He stood there with the letter in his hand. "It's done," she said. "It's done." He said it slowly, the way you say a thing you've been trying to believe for a long time and are now in the process of accepting as fact. "You'll want to get the water rights documentation properly filed at the county level," she said. "Archer said not to put it off." "I won't." He was still looking at the letter. "What Birch did with that survey, the county determination means there's a formal record of it now." "Yes." "He's not going to... I don't think he comes at us directly again." He looked up. "You know that doesn't mean he's finished. He'll find another way to be what he is." "I know," she said. "But the next time he tries something with your land or your family, the county record exists. He's not invisible anymore." Caleb set the letter on the table. He stood in the kitchen, which had been cleared and properly arranged and smelled of the bread she'd set to rise that morning, and he looked at it, not the letter, the kitchen, the room, with an expression she'd seen before on his face, but not quite like this. "I want to ask you something," he said. She was at the counter. She turned to face him. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it," he said. "I've been trying since January, probably. I keep starting it in my head and it comes out wrong." "Then say it wrong," she said. "I'll understand it." He almost smiled. The reluctant, brief version he mostly kept to himself. Then he said, "You came here to take care of my sons. That was the arrangement. That's what I asked for, and what you agreed to." He paused. "Somewhere in the middle of it, you became..." He stopped. "You became the thing this house was organized around, the center of it. Not because you tried to be, I don't think, just because you're the kind of person that happens with." He looked at her directly. "I don't want the arrangement to end because the boys are in a better place. I want you to stay because I want you to stay." The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, somewhere near the barn, she could hear Cole telling Ethan something at some length, and Ethan's short response, and then both of them moving off toward the fence line. "That's not wrong," she said. "It's not complete either," he said. "But I told you I didn't have a speech." "You don't need one." She looked at him. This man who had been trying to hold 3 grieving children and 300 acres together alone for 3 years, who had walked into a ladies' society meeting with his hat in both hands and asked the room for help, who had sat at his own table and listened to her tell him things he didn't want to hear and acted on them anyway, who was standing in his kitchen right now trying to say something true without the words for it. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I have opinions about everything. I don't ask for help when I should. I stay up too late worrying about problems that are going to be what they're going to be, regardless of how long I sit with them. I made decisions about your family without always telling you first. I know all of that, he said. I'm telling you so you can't say later that I didn't. Eliza. Yes, she said. I'll stay. He let out a breath. Not dramatic, just the breath of a man who has been holding something and has now set it down. He crossed the kitchen and stood close, and he took her hand in both of his, the way he'd held his hat in that first meeting room, with that same quality of holding something he didn't want to drop. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, she said. The kitchen garden needs another 2 beds dug before May and I have opinions about where they should go. That got the real version. The laugh she'd heard only a handful of times, brief and low and unguarded, and she kept her face straight with some effort. The spring settled over the Whitaker ranch. The way good things do when they finally arrive. Not all at once, not without ongoing difficulty, but with a solidity that hadn't been there before. The kitchen garden went in under Noah's management and Eliza's labor, and increasingly Cole's interest in the geometry of the bed layouts, which he had decided were insufficiently optimized, and took it upon himself to improve. Noah accepted this with the patience that surprised Eliza until she remembered that Noah had always understood that the things you grew needed tending from wherever it came. Ethan brought the Henderson boy to the barn every Saturday through April and into May, and somewhere in that time the teaching had become something closer to companionship, though Ethan would not have called it that. He would have said that the Henderson boy was not useless with horses, which was as close as Ethan's vocabulary for affection got, and everyone in the house understood the translation. Mrs. Henderson, for her part, sent occasional things over with her son. A covered dish, a bag of dried beans, once a cutting from a plant she thought might do well in the kitchen garden. Nothing that required acknowledgement of anything specific. Just the steady, small exchanges of neighbors who have decided, without formal announcement, that they are going to be good to each other. Margaret Holt remained in the social geography of Red Hollow, which meant she remained in the Whitakers' general vicinity, and she and Eliza maintained a relationship that was not warm but was honest, which Eliza valued more. Margaret had reorganized her view of the situation with the same efficiency she brought to everything else, and she had the capability, rare in people of her social position, to be wrong about something and absorb that fact without requiring everyone around her to pretend she hadn't been. She stopped Eliza in the mercantile one morning in May. The Archer boy is having his schooling privately this fall, she said. I thought you might be interested to know that Henry Archer specifically requested you be considered for the position. Eliza looked at her. I already have a position, she said. I know, Margaret said. I'm telling you because I thought you should know how people are talking about you now. She paused, and something moved in her expression that was the closest she came to saying directly what she meant. Differently than they were in October. People tend to update their views, Eliza said, when they have better information. Some of them, Margaret said, with the dry precision of a woman who has watched people not update their views for a long time. Some of them. Eliza nodded and went about her shopping. What she'd learned in the 8 months between the Ladies' Society meeting and the spring evening when she stood in the Whitaker kitchen and said yes was something she had no tidy way of summarizing and no particular interest in summarizing, because the things worth knowing are usually the things that resist being reduced to their simplest form. She had learned that children who behave badly are usually children who have been taught, by repeated experience, that the world is not reliable and that armor is more useful than openness. She had learned that teaching them otherwise is not a matter of removing the armor, you can't take it from them and you shouldn't try, but of creating, slowly and without announcement, the conditions in which they find they need it less. She had learned that staying is an active thing, not a passive one. Every day you're still there as a choice, and the children who have been left before know the difference between someone who is staying because they haven't left yet and someone who has decided to be there. They can tell. She didn't know exactly how, but they could. She had learned that the hardest thing a person can ask of themselves is to be seen clearly by someone whose opinion they've decided doesn't matter, and to let it matter anyway. She'd spent her whole life in rooms where she was told she was insufficient, and she'd protected herself against that by deciding those rooms were wrong, which they were. But the protection had costs she hadn't fully counted until she found herself in a house on the Kansas frontier with 3 children who needed her to actually be present, not defended. She had learned that communities are not fair, and that they are not unfair uniformly. Some people in every community are paying attention, doing the honest thing, holding the line in small ways that no one makes speeches about. Archer, who showed Delaney the papers. The Ostroms, who showed up with timber and rope. Mrs. Henderson, who accepted an apology from 2 boys and then invited everyone inside for coffee. The quiet infrastructure of people who do the right thing without requiring an audience for it. She had learned that Caleb Whitaker was a man whose depths ran considerably below the waterline of what he showed, and that the depths were worth the patience required to reach them. But the thing she came back to most, in the evenings when the house was settled and the lamp was burning and she sat with whatever she was working on while the sounds of the ranch settled around her, that thing was harder to name. She'd spent 34 years being told she wasn't enough, and she'd coped with that by becoming as competent as possible, by filling the space her appearance didn't grant her with usefulness and intelligence and the willingness to do difficult things. Which worked, which was not nothing, but which had also meant that for a very long time she'd understood her value in terms of what she could do rather than who she was. What the Whitaker house had taught her, what Ethan's first real conversation and Cole's wooden box and Noah's okay and Caleb's hand in both of his had taught her was that belonging is not the same thing as being useful. She had been useful her entire life. Belonging was different. Belonging was being in a place that knew you were there and had organized itself in small ways around the fact of your presence. Being expected. Being specifically missed when absent. Having your absence matter to people in the particular way that only specific people matter. She had thought, when she walked through the door of the ladies' society room in October, that she was looking for a job. She had been looking for this. Not in any way she'd have been able to articulate then. Not in any way that would have survived the scrutiny she applied to most of her own feelings. Just the plain, quiet, unadorned fact of being somewhere that was hers. On a May evening, with the last light going slow and golden over the flat land, Eliza sat on the porch steps. Not the middle one, which Noah had fixed in November, but the top one, which was solid, and watched the 3 Whitaker boys at the far edge of the yard. They were arguing about something involving a fence post and a level, and the argument had the productive quality of people who are trying to solve an actual problem rather than win a position. Ethan had the level, Cole had the post. Noah was standing slightly apart, watching both of them, and then he said something that made both his brothers stop and look at him, and then at each other, and then Cole made an adjustment to the post position, and Ethan checked the level, and whatever they were checking came out right. Caleb came out of the barn and stopped beside the porch, watching them. "Cole's right about the supplier," he said after a moment. "The numbers hold up. I checked them 3 times. "I know," Eliza said. "He's going to want to do more of it, the accounting." "Let him." Caleb sat down on the step beside her. They were close enough that their arms touched, which was not something either of them arranged and neither of them moved away from. "The water rights documentation," he said. "I'm filing it Friday." "Good. Archer's going to help me make sure it's airtight." "Better." He was quiet for a moment. Out in the yard, the fence post argument had concluded and the 3 of them were moving back toward the barn, still talking, the low continuous exchange of people who have gotten used to being in the same space. "I was thinking," Caleb said, "about what you need." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about what everyone else in this house needs since October," he said. "I don't think anyone's asked you what you need." She considered this. It was not a question she had a ready answer for, because he was right that it had not been a question she'd spent much time on. "A desk," she said finally. He looked at her. "A desk?" "My own. In my room. The table I've been using is too small for the ledgers." "That's all?" "That's what I need right now," she said. "The other things are already here." He looked out at the yard, at the place where his sons had just been, at the kitchen garden beds showing their green rows along the house's south wall, at the barn with its repaired roof section that would need better attention before next winter. "All right," he said. "I'll build you a desk." She looked at the evening land, the wide, flat, indifferent landscape that had seemed bleak to her in October, and now seemed simply honest. The kind of place that gave you exactly what you brought to it, and nothing more, which was fair, which was enough. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere, Not the version she'd imagined as a young woman, the approved institution, the appropriate arrangement, the life that would make the people who had dismissed her understand that they had been wrong. That version required other people to change their minds in order for her to be whole. This was different. This was hers regardless of what anyone in Red Hollow thought about it, because she'd built it. Not by being perfect, not by being selected, not by being someone's obvious first choice, but by showing up every morning and doing the work and staying when it would have been easier to go. She had never been unwanted. She saw that now with a clarity she hadn't had in October, or in Ohio, or in any of the years before. She had been in the wrong places, places that measured the wrong things and found her wanting for all the reasons that said more about the measurement than about her. She had needed to find a place that measured what she actually was. The evening settled around the Whitaker ranch. The lamp in the kitchen window had come on. Noah must have lit it, the way he'd started doing in the last month, quietly assuming the task. The chickens had gone to roost. The horses were quiet in the barn. Somewhere east of the fence line, the land ran on toward a horizon that had no drama in it, just distance, just the plain fact of how much world there was out there and how small any one life was inside it. It was enough to be small here, specific, known. The door opened behind them, and Cole leaned out, still dusty from the yard work, holding the frame with one hand and directing his remarks at neither of them in particular, which was how Cole addressed the world when he actually wanted an answer. "Is supper happening?" he said, "or is everyone just going to sit on the porch until we starve?" "Supper's happening," Eliza said, standing up. "Go wash your hands." "My hands are fine." "Cole." A pause. Then the door closed. She heard him calling to his brothers inside. Caleb stood up beside her. He was smiling. The real version, slow and private, the one that had taken her 3 months to see the first time. He held the door open for her, and she went inside into the warmth and the noise and the smell of what needed cooking, into the ordinary and ongoing business of a life that was hers.